Imagine you discover a mountain. Not a mountain of rock and dirt, but one made of pure, shimmering silver. A treasure so huge it could make your nation the richest, most powerful empire the world has ever seen. For 16th century Spain, this wasn't a fantasy. It was real. With the conquest of the New World, Spain unlocked a torrent of wealth that defied imagination. A river of silver flowed from the Americas straight into the coffers of the Spanish crown, funding colossal armies, magnificent palaces, and a global empire on which the sun never set. It was the dawn of Spain's golden age, a century of unmatched power and cultural brilliance, all paid for by what seemed like infinite treasure. But what if that infinite treasure wasn't a blessing? What if it was a curse in disguise? This is the unbelievable, paradoxical story of how a flood of American silver didn't build a lasting empire, but actually drowned it. It's the story of how finding so much treasure it makes your country poorer isn't just a weird thought experiment. It's a historical fact. This is how Spain's endless silver triggered hyperinflation, hollowed out its economy, funded its own destruction through endless war, and ultimately caused an entire empire to go broke. Part 1. The Dream. Before the silver, there was the dream. In the late 15th century, Spain was a new nation, forged from the union of its two largest kingdoms, Castile and Aragon. It was a nation built on a crusading zeal, fresh from completing the Reconquista, the long campaign to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula. But it was also a nation on the edge of the known world, overshadowed by the established powers of Europe. Its economy was mostly agrarian, its people were poor, and its future was anything but certain. Then, 1492 happened. An Italian mariner born in Genoa, Christopher Columbus, sponsored by the Spanish crown, sailed west and stumbled upon a new continent. In the decades that followed, Spanish conquistadors, a mix of hardened soldiers, ambitious adventurers, and zealous missionaries, carved out a vast empire in the Americas. They toppled the mighty Aztec and Inca empires with a ruthless combination of steel, horses, and disease. In their quest for gold, glory, and God, they found something far more important. At first, they just plundered artifacts, melting down priceless works of indigenous art into metal bars. But soon, they found the source. In 1545, high in the Andes of modern-day Bolivia, an Andean prospector named Diego Gualpa reportedly stumbled upon a literal mountain of silver ore. This was the Cerro Rico, the rich hill of Potosi. A year later, another massive silver deposit was found far to the north, in Zacatecas, Mexico. The sheer scale of these discoveries was like nothing the world had ever seen. The veins were so rich that, at first, the ore could be thrown directly into furnaces. By the mid-1500s, Potosi alone was estimated to be producing 60% of all the silver mined in the entire world. The Spanish expression, vale un Potosi, to be worth a Potosi, became a synonym for unimaginable fortune. From a desolate high-altitude wilderness, Potosi exploded into one of the largest and wealthiest cities on the planet, bigger than London or Paris at the time. It was a city of extreme wealth and even more extreme misery, built on a foundation of silver and human suffering. To get this wealth out of the ground, the Spanish used a brutal system of forced labor called the mita. This was a twisted version of an old Inca system of community labor. The colonial mita forced indigenous communities to send men to work in the mines under the most horrific conditions imaginable. They faced grueling 18-hour shifts in deep, unstable tunnels, breathing toxic mercury vapors used to refine the ore, and carrying heavy loads to the surface. The mountain became known in the local Quechua language as the mountain that eats men. One Spanish observer wrote that for every 7,000 men who went to the mines, only 2,000 returned. Their lives were consumed by the insatiable hunger for silver. This river of silver, stained with blood and tears, flowed from the mines, carried by llama trains to the coasts, and then loaded onto the famous Spanish treasure fleets. These convoys, guarded by armed galleons, sailed across the Atlantic to Seville, the gateway to Spain and all of Europe. By 1600, an estimated 25,000 tons of silver had been officially shipped to Spain, with maybe just as much smuggled to avoid the royal tax. This influx of precious metal transformed Spain, seemingly overnight, from a fringe European kingdom into the world's first global superpower. The silver funded the vast armies of the Habsburg emperors, Charles V, and his son Philip II. It built magnificent palaces like El Escorial. It allowed Spain to project its power across Europe, fighting wars against the French, the Dutch, the English, and the Ottoman Turks. Spain was, without question, the richest and most feared nation on earth. It was the ultimate dream realized. A nation had found a fountain of infinite money. But as the silver poured in, a strange and insidious process began. A poison was seeping into the heart of the empire, rotting its foundations from within. The treasure that was meant to be its salvation would prove to be its damnation. Spain was about to learn a brutal lesson. Money and wealth are not the same thing. Part 2. The Silver Pipeline. To really get what was happening, you have to follow the money. Before the Spanish showed up, the peoples of the Andes and Mesoamerica had been working with metals for centuries. They crafted beautiful objects from gold and silver. But these metals were valued for their spiritual meaning, not as money. The Inca, for instance, saw gold as the sweat of the sun, and silver as the tears of the moon. The Spanish arrival changed everything. After the initial phase of plundering and melting down centuries of priceless art, they found the real prize, the mines. The game changer came in the 1570s with a new technology, the mercury amalgamation process. This allowed the Spanish to extract silver from even low-grade ores by crushing them and mixing them with mercury. The mercury would bind with the silver, and then it was heated to burn off the mercury, leaving pure silver behind. This breakthrough, combined with the forced labor of the mita, caused silver production to explode. The Spanish crown had created a horrific yet brutally efficient industrial-scale extraction machine. From Potosí and Zacatecas, the silver was hauled to fortified port cities like Cartagena and Veracruz. Twice a year, the great treasure fleets would assemble. These weren't just a few ships. They were massive convoys designed to protect the treasure from pirates and rival nations. The fleets would meet in Havana, Cuba, before making the dangerous journey across the Atlantic to the port of Seville. For over a century, Seville was the center of the world. Every single ounce of legal American treasure had to pass through its gates, where the king's royal fifth, a 20% tax on all precious metals, was taken. But the silver didn't just stop in Spain. It became the world's first truly global currency in the form of the Spanish peso de ocho, the famous piece of 8. These coins were so reliable and common that they were accepted as currency across Europe, the Middle East, and, most importantly, in China. The Ming Dynasty had recently shifted its massive economy to a silver-based system, creating an almost bottomless demand for the metal. This created a wildly profitable global trade route. Spanish silver flowed from Europe to pay for goods and soldiers. It also flowed across the Pacific from Mexico to the Philippines in the famous Manila galleons. In Manila, the silver was traded for Chinese silks, porcelain and spices, which were then shipped back to America and onto Europe. For the first time in history, a single commodity was linking the economies of the Americas, Europe, and Asia. Spain stood at the very center of it all, an empire seemingly built of solid silver. The Spanish monarchs, Charles V and Philip II, believed they had been granted a divine gift. They saw the silver as an endless bank account to fund their imperial ambitions. The wealth was real, arriving in great, heavy galleons. How could that possibly be a bad thing? The problem was that the Spanish crown made a fatal mistake. They confused the symbol of wealth, the silver itself, for actual economic strength. They had the money, but they were about to lose their economy. Part 3. The Poisoned Chalice. The torrent of silver that was supposed to make Spain invincible instead acted like a slow-acting poison. It attacked the empire from 3 different angles at once. It created devastating inflation, it hollowed out Spain's ability to produce anything, and it was all wasted on a series of ruinous, never-ending wars. First, the price revolution. In simple terms, this was massive runaway inflation. Between 1500 and 1600, prices across Western Europe shot up, in some cases 6-fold. But in Spain, where all the silver was landing first, the effect was way worse. Prices for basic goods like grain and wine roughly doubled in the first half of the 16th century alone. Think of it this way. Imagine a small town where the baker makes 10 loaves of bread a day, and the 10 townspeople each have 1 silver coin. A loaf of bread costs 1 coin. Now, what if someone found a treasure chest and gave every single person 9 more silver coins? Suddenly, everyone feels rich. But the baker is still only making 10 loaves of bread. When the rich townspeople rush to buy bread, they just end up bidding against each other. The price of a loaf will quickly skyrocket from 1 coin to 10. Nobody's actually richer. Their ability to buy bread is exactly the same. That's exactly what happened to Spain. The country was flooded with silver coins, but the amount of actual stuff to buy, bread, cloth, tools, didn't increase at the same rate. As one sharp Spanish scholar, Martín de Azpilicueta, noted as early as 1556, in countries where there is a great scarcity of money, things and even the hands and labor of men are given for less money than where it is abundant. In other words, when money is common, it's worth less. For the average Spaniard, this was a disaster. While prices for everything they needed were soaring, wages couldn't keep up. For a peasant farmer, a city laborer, or even a minor noble living on a fixed income, life became a struggle. Their savings were wiped out. The vast wealth of the Americas was somehow making them poorer. The second deadly effect is what modern economists call the resource curse, or Dutch disease. The flood of silver made Spain's currency super strong. This had 2 effects. First, it made Spanish-made goods incredibly expensive for other countries to buy. Why buy pricey Spanish cloth when you could get it cheaper elsewhere? Second, it made foreign goods incredibly cheap for Spaniards. With pockets full of silver, why bother making anything at home when you could just import it? Spain's own industries, which had been growing nicely, were systematically wiped out. The famous textile workshops of Segovia and Toledo withered. Its shipbuilding declined. Even its farming stagnated. Spain stopped being a country that made things and became a country that bought things. The irony was savage. The silver mined by forced labor in the Americas flowed into Spain, drove up prices, and then flowed right back out to enrich Spain's economic rivals, the Dutch, English, French, and Italians, who supplied Spain with the goods it no longer produced itself. As one Spanish thinker, Tomás de Mercado, complained in 1571, high prices ruined Spain as the prices attracted Asian commodities and the silver currency flowed out to pay for them. Spain became a leaky bucket, a simple channel for the world's silver, which passed through and ended up watering the economies of its enemies. The third and final nail in the coffin was what Spain actually did with the money. The Spanish Habsburg kings, Charles V and Philip II, saw themselves as the defenders of the Catholic faith, and they used the American treasure to fund an insanely ambitious foreign policy. They were constantly at war. There was the endless, grinding war in the Netherlands, the wars against France, the naval war against the Ottoman Empire, and, of course, the doomed invasion of England with the Invincible Armada in 1588, a fantastically expensive disaster. These wars were so expensive that even the mountains of silver were never enough. The Spanish crown became trapped in a vicious cycle of debt. The king started borrowing money from international bankers, using future silver shipments as collateral. Long before the treasure fleet even arrived in Seville, its cargo was already spent. They were living on a high-interest credit card, using the promise of future silver to pay for present wars. By the end of Philip II's reign, a huge chunk of the government's income went just to paying the interest on its debts. The silver hadn't brought security. It had brought a crippling addiction to debt and war. Part 4. The Great Default. For decades, Spain juggled its massive military spending and its shaky finances, always one step ahead of total collapse. The silver fleets were a lifeline. But a system built on borrowing is never sustainable. The day of reckoning had to come. For Spain, it came over and over again. The climax of this story isn't a dramatic battle, but a series of quiet, bureaucratic announcements, state bankruptcies. Despite having all the silver in the world, the Spanish crown declared bankruptcy an astonishing number of times. In 1557, 1575, 1596, 1607, 1627, 1647, and on and on. Now, a royal bankruptcy back then wasn't like a modern one. The king didn't lose his throne. It was more like the king telling his creditors, the very bankers who were funding his wars, that he was unilaterally changing the terms of the deal. He suspended interest payments and forcibly converted short-term high-interest loans into long-term low-interest bonds that were basically junk. For the bankers, this was a catastrophe. For Spain, it was even worse in the long run. Each bankruptcy destroyed the king's credit. It became harder and more expensive to borrow money, making it even harder to pay the army, which led to more crises. The bankruptcy of 1575 had a particularly awful result. Unable to pay his army in the Netherlands, Philip II's unpaid soldiers mutinied and went on a rampage, brutally sacking the city of Antwerp. The Spanish fury was so horrific that it united all the Dutch provinces against Spanish rule, dragging out a war that would bleed Spain dry for another 70 years. The financial mess created by the silver was now making the wars even worse. As the 17th century went on, the silver flow started to decline. The richest veins in Potosi were being exhausted. This drop in revenue, combined with the crushing debt and constant wars, was the final blow. The empire that had once seemed invincible was visibly crumbling. Spain lost the Netherlands. It lost Portugal. It suffered humiliating defeats to the French, and the Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659 is often seen as the formal end of Spanish dominance in Europe. Internally, Spain was a shadow of its former self. The once bustling cities fell into disrepair. A deep sense of decline and disillusionment, what the Spanish called decadencia, set in. The great irony was now complete. The silver had been found, the fleets had sailed, and the kings had spent it all. But Spain was left poorer, weaker, and more indebted than ever. It had squandered a once-in-a-millennium opportunity. The empire wasn't defeated by an enemy. It was hollowed out from the inside by its own treasure. Part 5. The Modern Echo. The story of the Spanish Empire and its mountain of silver is one of the great cautionary tales in economics. Spain made a fundamental error. It mistook glittering treasure for real, sustainable wealth. It had the money, but it lost the productive, diversified economy. The silver acted not as a foundation, but as a flood that washed away local industry and left a barren landscape when it receded. The paradox is that the very thing that made Spain the richest empire on earth was the same thing that guaranteed its decline. Every galleon full of silver that arrived in Seville was another nail in the coffin of the Spanish economy. It fueled the inflation that impoverished its people. It encouraged the crown to import rather than innovate, and it funded the endless wars that bankrupted the state. Spain became the first and most dramatic victim of the resource curse, a problem that still plagues nations today that are too dependent on a single valuable resource, whether it's oil, gas, or diamonds. And this is where the story starts to sound uncomfortably familiar. The temptation of easy money is a constant in human history. Spain's silver was the 16th century equivalent of being able to print infinite money. The Spanish crown thought it had solved the problem of scarcity, that it could fund its ambitions without making hard choices or relying on the prosperity of its own citizens. Does that ring any bells? Today, we don't have treasure fleets, but modern economies face similar temptations through national debt and monetary policy. When governments fund massive deficits by borrowing, or when central banks create new money out of thin air, they're grappling with the same trade-offs that Spain faced. There's always the risk of devaluing currency, fueling inflation that hurts ordinary people, and creating bubbles that mask real economic weakness. The Spanish experience is a stark warning that there is no shortcut to prosperity. Real wealth isn't dug from the ground or printed on a press. It's built, slowly and painfully, through innovation, investment, education, and a resilient, diverse economy. The ultimate lesson here is a simple one. A nation's strength lies not in the gold in its vaults, but in the ingenuity of its people. Spain had the treasure, but it lost its wealth. It won the lottery, and then went spectacularly broke. It's a story that should be required reading for anyone who wants to understand the fragile nature of prosperity. Spain mistook a mountain of silver for a foundation of rock. Are we so sure we're not making the same mistake today? If you want to uncover more of these hidden economic lessons from history, the stories of booms, busts, and the surprising forces that shape our world, then make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. History is full of these warnings, and understanding them is the first step to not repeating them. Thanks for watching.